The video you're about to watch will show examples of different answers to the same case question. You will see sample interview questions and you'll see 3 different answers. All 3 answers are pretty good, and in fact, none would be so bad that you wouldn't pass someone on to the next round. However, one answer is better than the others. So as you watch, listen to the answers and try to figure out which answer is the best and why. Also, try to figure out why the other 2 were not the best answer. Finally, assume that each question stands on its own. When a person answers in one question, don't assume they are the same person when they answer a later question. We've mixed them up, so each time the best answer is not from the same person as the question before. So with that, let's dive in and see what we can learn by watching 3 different responses to the same interview question.
So before we solve this 3D television question, I want us to first get ourselves in the minds of the CEO of a branded television company. And what I'd like you to think about is, if you're the CEO, what are the most important meetings you're facing in a given week? What are the things that are keeping you up late at night? What determines whether or not you win or lose? What really matters to you?
Sure. So if I'm the CEO of this company, the things that I would be thinking most about are the fact that we're in a high technology industry.
Okay.
And so when we're thinking about what our competitors are doing, it's going to be those features that are differentiating our product to the market.
Yes.
And so what would be keeping me up at night, I think, as CEO, would be the technology features,
Yes.
what we can add from the engineering side to really differentiate our products from what the competitors are doing on the market.
I think, if I'm the CEO of a television company, the first and foremost thing that's always on my mind is how am I going to make money? So
Good.
I'm thinking about the income statement and profits.
Okay.
And as we know, profits are revenue minus costs.
Right.
So
Okay.
on both sides of that, I think, on the revenue side, I'd really want to be focused on selling, meeting with my sales force.
Okay.
How can we improve our marketing efforts?
Yes.
How can we keep our operations moving efficiently?
Good.
And then on the cost side, I think, you need to be looking at things like sourcing and can we be cost cutting? How do we think about manufacturing?
Okay, great.
When I think back at televisions, I look at my own experience.
Okay.
So the last time I maybe went to a Best Buy to look at televisions.
Great.
When I was there, I saw a lot of similar sets. Couldn't quite tell what the technology difference was, what the different features are.
Right.
And so I'd assume to the average customer, it's kind of hard to figure out what those differences really are.
Yes.
And so, therefore, I would think about branding, because in my personal experience, I know that a Sony may be better than a different product, but I never know exactly why.
Okay.
So what can my marketing team be doing different to make sure that that is clearer to our consumers?
Good.
Second, I think that there's, when you're sitting in the store, you see a bunch of different TVs, and the prices do seem to be different. So how does that affect my personal business?
Yeah.
How can I look at pricing? Is that supply chain making that more efficient? Is it sourcing materials from different places, kind of diving into some of those areas?
All 3 of these answers are very strong, and clearly these candidates are articulate. But the best answer is number 3, Kristen. We like her answer because it's not a canned answer. She's actually taken the television market and put it in her own experience. She's thought about how it really works. And she recognizes that what matters is branding and cost. That's what differentiates who wins and loses in the TV industry. It explains why people like Sony spend a lot of money paying Peyton Manning to advertise Sonys, and why people believe that Sonys might be better than an RCA. And of course, when you buy a TV, you think about cost, the price. And so focusing on cost structure matters. So Kristen did a nice job of pulling that together. Answer number 1 is also good, Gail's. She talks about it being a high-tech product. And what we like there is she's got to the point of figuring out that there's something that matters. There's something that makes one win versus the other. But unfortunately, in this case, she's chosen the wrong thing. TVs are much less than a high-tech product. They're more like washing machines than they are personal computers when it comes to buying a consumer television set. And so she got the right idea that there's something that differentiates, but she just got the wrong issue. So it's starting to raise a question about business judgment. And then, of course, answer number 2, Jen's answer about profitability and revenues and costs is just very generic. She articulates it very well, so you almost become convinced that it's the right answer. But in fact, her answer would apply to a donut shop, an auto dealership, or a branded TV manufacturer. We know that she's a polished speaker, but we have good questions at this point about business judgment. So, best answer, number 3, Kristen. So before we go into the detail of how we actually figure this out, I'd like to know how you're going to think about it. In other words, what's going to make you figure out whether or not you should go 3D with glasses, 3D without glasses, or maybe not do 3D at all? How are you going to think about that?
Do you mind if I take a few seconds to think about it?
Sure.
As you mentioned, we have 3 options to choose from here. I think I would want to understand, it's almost a what do you have to believe question. There's a couple things that I want to look at, and I think you need to think about which option is going to be sort of the best in this what do you have to believe question.
Right.
So the first thing is just investment. You'd mentioned that each option sort of has different investment criteria. So I'd really want to understand, which of the options actually has the highest ROI and return on investment.
Okay.
The second, I think, is looking at the competitive marketplace. And I'd really want to understand sort of how the competitors are going to react and which of the options might have the best sort of competitive reaction for my business.
Okay.
The third, I think, that I'd want to look at is my existing business.
Okay.
So, which of the 3 options are going to sort of create the least cannibalization on my existing sort of non-3D market.
Okay.
And then the last, I think, another important thing to look at is just execution. So are we going to be able to execute on this as a company, and which of the options has sort of the least execution risk?
Do you mind if I take a second just to think about this?
Sure.
So if I were to think about this, there are 3 different buckets that I want to consider.
Okay.
So that would first be looking at the revenues, second, the investment and costs upfront, and then third, comparing those to the status quo. So within each of those, on the revenue side, you mentioned that we'll have a different profitability depending upon if we go with the glasses option or the no glasses.
Yes.
The price point will be different, and we'll need to think through how that impacts the business.
Okay, good.
Second, in terms of costs, you also mentioned that it would actually require a different amount of investment on our end to develop the 2 different types of products. So we'll want to figure out what the actual amount of investment is and how that compares to the profitability.
Okay.
Finally, once we have those 2 pieces for the no glasses and glasses options, we'll want to compare that to the status quo. So what are we actually doing today, and how do our economics look today?
Well, in order to sort of believe which is the right way to head, I'd look at 4 different things. So the first thing I would look at is customers. How are my customers going to accept this new product?
Yes.
I'd have to imagine that someone would prefer to watch TV without the glasses, but there's a little bit more of doing some research and seeing what our customers are really thinking there. The second thing I would look at is what are my competitors going to do? How easy is it going to be for them to go to market? What are they going to be thinking about pricing? I think there's a lot of interesting information that could be seen there.
Okay.
Third, I think about cost implications, obviously, sort of how are we going to have to change what materials we're sourcing? What are the R&D costs going to be?
Okay.
How, just sort of looking at those topics in more details.
Good.
And then the fourth thing I would think about is kind of how is this fitting in with my current capabilities? How can I use the processes I already have in place to make this? How is it going to affect my current products that I'm offering? So those are the 4 things I would look at.
2 of these answers are very good, but the preferred answer is number 1, Jen. Notice what Jen does. She has an answer-first approach to her answer. She says, this is what you'd have to believe. And then she goes through 4 different buckets to frame how she's going to do her analysis, focusing on the economics. What are competitors going to do? What's it going to do to the existing business? And then hitting execution risk. And the fact that she's thinking not just about the analysis, but also execution, implies that she kind of has a practical results delivery mindset. It's a good, solid framework that allows her to do the analysis to figure out what the right answer is. Gail also has a nice framework. She highlights 3 things, economics, costs, and then comparing it to the status quo. It's an okay framework, but because the fact that you're going to think about status quo when you're looking at economics and costs really mean that it's not quite as sophisticated as Jen's was. And so answer 2 is not quite as strong as answer 1, but we certainly would have been very happy hearing that answer as well. And then finally, answer 3, Kristen's, where she walks through effectively a 4 C's framework. Probably has thought about it before she's walked in the room, has already decided that how we ask a question, she's going to probably use that type of framework. And while she's very articulate in describing it, it's unclear how we're going to tie that back to the analysis she's going to need to solve this problem. So overall, the right answer is number 1, Jen. So I hear you saying that the volume of 3D TVs is very important. How are you going to figure out what the ramp-up volume is of the 3D TVs? In other words, how fast they're going to buy them when you first start to launch the product?
Well, clearly this is a new product. So one of the first things I'd want to look at is just what the adoption is going to look like. Okay. And I know from other new product introductions that typically the adoption looks kind of like an S-curve. You have your early adopters until the rest of the market catches on. So in order to figure out what the shape of that S-curve might look like, I'd probably look at other comparable products and those introductions. So something like high-definition TVs, also a TV product, you could look at that and sort of see how that performed in the market. iPads might be another comparable example. Okay. But I think ultimately the question is, how fast or how much does it ramp up, and sort of what's the maximum that it's going to get to? I would actually believe that most of the market, if not all of the market, is going to get there. 3D TVs are obviously better functionality than 2D TVs. Mm-hmm. Of course, there's always the chance that just no one or very few people adopt it, in which case it'd be a very short and small S-curve.
It's a good question. This is a brand new product and nobody's ever bought a 3D television before. And so there's no current data that we could use to tell us that. So what I really would like to do is a market research survey. Okay. Because I think what we could do is actually ask consumers, first, would they be interested in buying a 3D television? Yep. And then second, at what price point would they be willing to buy a 3D television? And so if we took that data together, we could have an understanding of what the maximum market share could potentially be. Okay. And so we know that there will be a ramp up because this is a new product. We're not going to immediately hit that number. Okay. And so to understand what our volume could be in the ramp up period, our best assumption would be to take the average between today at 0 and that maximum that we find through market research.
Well, since we don't have 3D televisions yet, we sort of are going to have to make a bunch of assumptions here. Okay. So let me start with, there's 100 million households in the United States. Okay. You told me earlier that I believe it was every 4 years a household's buying a new TV. Yes. So we can assume that 25 million households will buy a TV. Okay. I'd assume not everyone's going to want a 3D TV, so I'm going to make an assumption. Let's call it 20% are going to want to buy a TV, which gets us down to 5 million households that will actually buy 3D TVs. Okay. I'd make a guess that not everyone's going to buy it in the first year. So let's say about 1 million will buy it in the first year. Okay. And then maybe the next year we'll have about 2 million folks buying TVs. And eventually that will ramp up and we'll get to that 5 million, the 5 million households which will actually buy our TVs.
The best answer is number 2, Gail's answer. She realizes that the only way to understand the potential demand is to go and talk to the customer, to do primary customer research, which of course is what we do here at Bain. She also recognizes that there's going to be a relationship between price and volume. So even if she's telling you a little bit about how she would design that survey, she's already highlighting that issue, which is you've got to be thinking about price because that's going to impact the volume. So it shows a real level of sophistication. Finally, the thing we like about Gail's answer is that she also recognizes that the ramp-up volume is not going to all happen on day one, that you're going to go from 0 to something. And the way you would analytically start to think about that is taking the average between point 0 and point n. She's obviously got an analytical background, even while she's giving you a practical thought about how to gather this data. So a very strong answer. Answer number 1 by Jen is good. She talks about S-curves, and of course there is an S-curve, and she clearly understands the dynamics of how new products get adopted. But in this case, it's a little bit too theoretical. because while it may be an S-curve shape, we don't know what the exact parameters of that S-curve will be. There's no market exactly like 3D televisions. And so you still don't get a sense of what the total volume will be, which of course makes it hard for you to figure out and calculate the economics later on. You have to anchor that in some way, shape, or form. So right kind of business judgment, but maybe not quite pragmatic and not thinking about the analytics. And answer number 3, Kristen's, is just not the right answer. She comes in and starts making a lot of assumptions. And I think showing that she is comfortable making such assumptions, but that's not what we're really testing here. What we're testing to see is whether or not they understand how you'd go and get this and get the right data. So the best answer, once again, is number 2, Gail's answer. So given everything that we've talked about up to this point, which option do you choose?
So I would choose option number 2, the television without glasses. First, the economics are far superior. So we'll see an incremental profitability of $750 million versus the $300 million of profitability that we would see with the first option, the television with glasses.
Okay.
And now that $750 million is also incremental and on top of the $500 million upfront investment that we'll need to make to develop the technology.
Okay.
Outside of just the economics, we'll also be providing a better customer experience. So people in their homes would far prefer to be watching 3D television without glasses. So we'll not only be more profitability for our company, but will also be a stronger option for the customer.
You know, we've talked about sort of the economics of each. I think, you know, option 1 is good. It's less risky. You don't have to risk as much money up front. It's a little bit safer. But it has less of a payoff in the end.
Yes.
However, on the other hand, option 2 has this great, you know, a big payout, $750 million. But it makes me really nervous that we'd have to invest sort of $500 million up front.
Right.
That's, you know, twice as much as, or more than twice as much as we make in a year. And that just seems like something that, you know, I would be nervous if the market doesn't take off and we end up losing a lot of money. On the other hand, option 1, you know, feels a little too safe in some ways, and maybe we're not capitalizing on the right things. But ultimately, I think if I had to choose, I'd go with option 1. It just seems to be the better and safer option. But I'd really want to see what happens with option 2 and see how that plays out.
Well, Mark, when we started talking, I said that I was going to look at 3 different things. Yes. First being the economics, second being market acceptance, and the third being execution risk. So when I look at the first of those, the economics, clearly option 2, going without the glasses, is the better investment for us, a bigger return on our investment at the end of the day. But then when I look at option 2, which is market acceptance, I realize that there's just uncertainty about what's going to happen. We just don't have enough data on whether folks are going to be interested in this product or not. And what I'm thinking about here is, you know, if we go with option 1, which is just with glasses, do we have the opportunity to go into option 2 later, kind of test it out in the market, see if that works, and then we can invest in option 2 later once we can see what our customers are interested in. And the third is execution risk, which kind of follows a similar story. So I would assume that executing without glasses is going to be a much harder undertaking. Yes. Obviously, we know the R&D dollars are much higher, but the technology is just going to be more difficult. And so therefore, we wouldn't be able to backtrack if all of our competitors go with option 1. And so that leads me to believe that option 1's our better, our safer bet there, the smarter bet. So looking at all this, the clear answer to me is option 1. I know I lose a little bit of the short-term economic incentives of going with option 2, but I know that long-term option 1 is the best option for us because eventually if we wanted to go into launching a TV without 3D glasses, we'd have a nice platform in order to do that. But I think right now the clear answer is option 1.
All 3 candidates do a very nice job of pulling back the facts of the work that they've just gone through and analyzed. They can make an argument. But answer number 3, Kristen, is the best. Most notably, what she does is she takes her argument and ties it back to that original hypothesis and framework that she set out at the beginning. So in that way, it's easy for you to understand it. She walks through and gives a very cogent argument And we like that she firmly takes a stand. Number 1, Gail, also takes a stand. And she makes an argument too, talking about the economics and the customer experience. But it doesn't, once again, tie back to what we talked about at the beginning, and it's very pithy. It's almost like she's giving a simple answer. We'd expect a little bit more sophistication. Once again, not bad, good, but not as strong as answer number 3, which was Kristen. And then finally, with answer number 2, Jen, good argument. She understands all the facts, but she's very wishy-washy. You hear her talking about with glasses, without glasses, and back and forth. And so it raises a concern there that while she may have done an excellent job of analysis, actually taking action and deciding what she wants to do may be a little bit more difficult for her. The best answer, though, number 3, Kristen, she ties it back to our hypothesis, she takes a firm stand, and she understands everything that she did up to that point. Okay, I hear that you're going to do option 1, 3D with the glasses. But what happens if once we launch the product, we figure out that in fact nobody buys it? There's very low market acceptance. What happens then?
That would be quite unfortunate given the investment we made. But in the end, I'm really glad I actually went with option 1 because I didn't destroy the company. I didn't sort of invest the largest amount of money, and now we still can sort of move forward with our existing technologies. On the other, in addition, I think I'm also glad I did this and went through this exercise and developed this technology because now I'm smart about it, I understand it, and we have the technology available. So if in the future it does become popular or a competitor sort of goes full-fledged into the market with this technology, we have something to compete with. And furthermore, there actually may be an opportunity to sort of recoup my investment in a different way, potentially licensing the technology, maybe to the military, or maybe there's some other applications or somebody who might value it for a different purpose than the consumer market.
Well, then I'm very glad I went with option 1. Given our, the investment of $100 million to go with glasses versus the investment of $500 million to go without, it clearly made sense given our current profitability of $200 million. So we haven't destroyed the business, we haven't bet the farm, we're going to continue moving forward. So I'm obviously glad that I went with the first option. And frankly, I have to tell you, Mark, I'm not all that surprised by this. I'm never really thought 3D TVs were going to take off anyway. So I wonder if given, not being forced to make a decision, I would have never launched anyway, which was probably the right call.
It's really interesting because all of our market research studies, they showed that customers are really excited about this product. So that really leads me to think that it's a problem on our end. Maybe we haven't been advertising the product appropriately. Okay. Maybe we can go back and do some more consumer market research studies with the actual advertisements that we're using to make sure that our message is really reaching our end customer. Okay. Second, I wonder if it's really just a problem with the content that's available. Okay. So perhaps there just aren't enough 3D television shows being made. So we might actually want to look at investing further in companies that are producing television shows for 3D to make sure there's enough content for our consumers to actually be taking in their house. So in the end, I think that this is still a viable market, and I think we just need to ensure that we are executing appropriately. I think that the market will be there, and we just need to be patient in developing it.
So now we've thrown in a twist. After they've gone through and solved the case, assuming that there's going to be demand, we tell them that in fact that assumption's not true. It doesn't work out that way. And it's important to throw a twist in on candidates to see how they react to it. As you look at the answers, number 1's, Jen's is the best. First, she accepts the fact that that's what the data says. And because she's done a nice job of understanding the case, she realizes that if it's not there, it's not there. She then talks about the fact that she gets some value, and she understood that there was some learning that occurred because they went through this exercise and launched the product. She understands that it's building corporate capability. It sounds very real world. And then the thing we like most about her in this case is that she comes up with a creative idea. Even though it might not work for consumer televisions, it could work in another market, military and licensing. So it really feels like a business person talking to you who's just been dealt a bad hand or an unfortunate event and making the best out of it. Answer number 2, Kristen's is also pretty good. She's clearly very smart because she immediately gets the fact that if it doesn't work out the way that we said it was going to work out, the big company is still in business. We didn't bet the farm, she says. However, is she really going to be open to accepting the data that gets put in front of her and accepting the situation? And then, of course, we finally get to answer number 3, Gail's answer, which is a little bit alarming and raises some questions. She clearly is committed to her answer to launch. She still thinks it's a good idea. She's either very inflexible or she's a fighter. Notice that she starts saying we'd have to do different things. We'd have to market it differently. We'd have to go and push harder. She believes the market's there. Yet there's really no reason for her to take such a strong stand because the only thing she knows is what we've told her throughout the period of this case. But for some reason, she's locked onto it. And so that should raise some red flags of what she might be like when a client tells her something. Will she be able to question it and raise outside issues? Or will she just lock into it? And will we be able to manage her if a work stream changes? So certainly some red flags here that would be worth checking in a later question or perhaps in a second round interview. But overall, number 1, Jen's answer was the best. Okay, so now I'd like you to think about the analytical achievement you're most proud of. And by that I mean where you really nailed something, where you were at your best, where you might have said to yourself, I really crushed that. Can you give me an example of that?
One good example for you. When I was working at Goldman Sachs, we were putting together a book for an IPO that needed to go out.
Okay.
And so this was going to be presented to a few analysts, and the deadline was 3 weeks away. Plenty of time. We all felt very good about that. We found out that they had to move the deadline up a week, and so we had 2 weeks to finish the rest of our work, which you can imagine was quite stressful for all that were involved.
Yes.
And I have to tell you, it was sort of sheer panic in the group. I was very surprised that folks didn't know where to focus their energy. There was no sort of game plan. And so I was able to say, these are the spreadsheets that need to get done. These are the processes we need to be in place. These are our end goals. And so kind of get the team going. And then it was just all about pulling all-nighters, putting my head down, getting that work done.
Okay.
And at the end of the day, we made the deadline. It was a successful meeting. We were very happy. And I'm personally proud of it because of the investment I was able to put in. And I think that I really contributed to it being a success.
So before business school, I was working at Johnson & Johnson, specifically on their cough syrup brand.
Okay.
And so they had traditionally only sold a 4-ounce size. And I started thinking about cough syrup and the different SKUs that we actually provide. And I wondered whether or not it made sense for actually us to move into the 8-ounce size as well, to have a larger product for people, especially thinking about a family, right, who multiple people might be sick. They probably need more than a 4-ounce product. Mm-hmm. So I started running some analyses. I did some sensitivity analyses. I collected all the data that I could and looked at what competitors are actually doing. And it turns out that I found there's a very strong potential in this market. So I came back and I pitched the idea to both the sales team and the brand team, and they were very positive about it. And they actually gave me the go-ahead to set up a test and run a pilot. And the pilot was very successful, and we've actually now rolled out an 8-ounce cough syrup brand, and it's been very successful to date, and I actually always buy it when I get sick.
I think the example I'll talk about was back actually when I was an undergrad.
Okay.
And I was taking a programming class, and I'm not a CS major, I'm not a math major, so this was pretty tricky and pretty challenging for me. So we had to write a program where actually you had to calculate all of the prime numbers between 1 million and 2 million.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was pretty funny. So it was pretty complicated. I was really nervous about it, lost sleep a little bit. And then I sort of sat down and was able to figure it out and wrote the program. And not only that, I got the best grade in the class. And I was just really proud of that in the end because it's not something that necessarily I was focused on or majoring in, but I was still able to succeed.
When asking experience questions, there's no right or wrong answer. We're asking these questions to learn what type of teammate this candidate might be, what their strengths and weaknesses are as far as how they would behave on an actual case. And so we want to be careful here, not just to say what is the best answer, but really more importantly, what are we learning from the answer? What are we learning about the person? So, for example, answer number 1, Kristen from Goldman Sachs. She talks about being a hard worker. And she defines being at her best as when she was able to push through things, which is great. We certainly want hard workers at Bain & Company. But note that she doesn't talk about a truly analytical achievement. It raises a question, which is she may be somebody who really pushes through, but she hasn't given us an indication that she demonstrates being at her best as being smart or analytical. So not a fatal flaw, but just something we want to check on. Answer number 2, Gail's answer, the cough syrup, the new SKU of cough syrup, is the answer I like the best. I liked it because she talks about figuring something out, and she talks about the analytical process she went through. But perhaps more interesting to me is that she talks about then convincing people to do something, and the fact that they actually change behavior. It feels very Bain-like, the fact that she can talk about a measurable change because of something she did. However, notice that there's 2 questions that come to my mind when we listen to Gail's answer. One is, it seems a little simplistic that why wouldn't this company have thought about an 8-ounce product before? It seems a little unrealistic that she's the first person to ever come up with that. So maybe she's sort of manufacturing that story. And then a little bit at the end, she talked about the word me a couple times. Once again, not a fatal flaw. I like the story that she went through, but just something we're going to want to pay attention to. And finally, number 3, Jen's answer, the computer program. She took our question literally, analytical achievement she was most proud of, and clearly designing this computer program was a very difficult challenge. But it's not really applicable to the real world or what we do at Bain. And so while she's answered the question, it does start to raise questions, which is she theoretical? Is she somebody who is just very analytical? And is that really when she's at her best? I also wonder with Jen that, is this something that she thinks of was a rarity that she saw this computer program, or is this how she normally is? But once again, all 3 answers are fine. We've learned something very important about each candidate. I want you to picture a team that you've been on, a team of peers. It could be a school team or a work team. If I were to bring those people here today and have them around the table and say, give me some constructive criticism on you. What can you do better from a team dynamic? What would they tell me you need to improve?
I think they probably tend to say that I take on too much of the work myself.
Okay.
I'm always sort of looking for ways to help out and take things over. If we have a lot going on as a team, I'll take on too much myself.
Yes. And why do you think you do that?
I think it's probably because some of these things I take really seriously, maybe more seriously than some of my team members.
Okay.
Ultimately, I don't want to see us fail as a team. I have my grade's on the line as well, and I want to make sure that we succeed.
Good question. I think that they would say that I typically avoid confrontation.
Okay. Tell me a little bit more about that.
So I think what they would say is that I really want everybody to get along. I think the team is most productive when everybody is, feeling good about the team and they're happy working with each other. Mm-hmm. And I've just never found it productive to publicly embarrass people in front of their peers, mm-hmm. or have those conversations in front of others. I think many of those situations are best handled offline.
I think the number 1 issue for me is that I'm taking on too much. I'm working too hard. That's feedback I've gotten before, and
is that
something I've heard.
Is that something that you need to improve on? That sounds good.
It's a little bit of both. I think it's both a good and a bad. I think what I find in situations is that I'm often able, not necessarily to get to the answer sooner, but to push forward a little bit quicker than the rest of my team. And so because of that, I'm trying to help the team. And so not only am I doing sort of my own work, but I'm also kind of helping them get up to speed, and therefore just kind of taking on a little bit more than I normally would.
In this question, we're asking about people's weaknesses. And once again, we learned something interesting about all 3 candidates. The first answer from Jen, she talks about taking on too much work and how she pulls it all onto herself. And it raises a question. Is she somebody who doesn't really trust her teammates? Is she just too much of a ball hog? Does she want to put the spotlight on herself? Or in fact, is she somebody who's very much at cause? She says she takes the work very seriously and that she's committed to success. Obviously, if it's the second set of characteristics, that's a great Bain person, somebody who will do anything that needs to be done to make sure we get the right answer. But if it's somebody who doesn't really trust her teammates, well, that's a more serious question. Answer 2 from Gail, where she talks about avoiding confrontation. Your natural reaction is to assume maybe she's passive. But in fact, maybe she's just very good at people management, and that she understands that you can't always have an in-your-face style, and that in fact she might be really terrific at creating change in organizations. And then finally with Kristen, the third answer, she doesn't really want to answer the question about weakness. You notice that she wants to keep making it back a strength. She says, well, I'm a hard worker. And then I asked her, well, is that bad? And she says, well, sometimes I try to do too much, and I'm oftentimes the smartest person. And she's just continually coming back and making it sound like any weakness is not really a weakness. She really doesn't want to let you know what her weakness is. So we haven't really learned that. She clearly is a very confident young lady and might be a great Bainey. But we want to understand this issue about whether or not she really understands how it feels to work on a team with her. Once again, none of these answers are bad. We just learned some different things. What do you think the hardest part about coming to Bain & Company would be for you?
For me, I think one of the challenges could be just the way that the staffing process works.
Okay.
So knowing that I could be on a variety of different cases that don't necessarily line up with sort of where my interests are, what my background is.
Okay.
So I could see that that could be challenging, working on some of those cases. There's a lot of variability in staffing, and I think that that would be a challenge.
For me personally, I think it will be going to a client where I am young and I'm new. I may not have worked in the industry before with that particular client, and knowing that I can do great analyses. I have the data and analytics side behind me, and I have the support of my Bain team. But actually trying to change that from just being the data and to implementing it with my clients who might be set in their ways. They've been working in this industry perhaps for many years, if not their whole career. They have a certain way that they do things, and to me, it's pretty intimidating to actually think about changing their behaviors.
So I think the hardest part, I believe, is actually sort of gaining credibility with your clients. I realize that Bain has a whole support system and sort of a team mentality, but ultimately it comes down to me to be the expert in this field. And you're working with clients who've been doing this maybe their entire lives and really have achieved expert status. And from my perspective, I think I'll just have to work really hard to come up to speed. I think it's possible, and I'm excited to do it, but it's definitely something that could be a challenge.
In asking this question, we hope to learn a few things. One is, do they really understand what it is that Bain does and how our industry works? Many people are unfamiliar or have romanticized what it's like to be a management consultant. And of course, it's a very hard job, as we all know. And so we want to make sure they come in eyes wide open. And so we want to understand that. And in fact, by hearing how they articulate what they think the challenges of the job will be, it helps us start to figure out not just what kind of questions we should ask them, but even things like who we should be mapping onto them and what kind of conversations we might have in closing when we in fact make them an offer. And then of course, by asking what part they think they personally would have a hard time with, we learn a little bit about what they think might be their weaknesses or where they might have some insecurities. So as we look at answer number 1 from Kristen, who talks about the staffing process, she talks about the fact that she might be put on a case that she's unfamiliar with, or maybe not something that she was thinking about or energized her. It raises a question: is she afraid of new things? Is she going to be open to be putting on a case that's a little bit out of her comfort zone? And so we want to push her on that, and in fact make sure that people tell her that, yeah, in the first year or two, you might in fact be put on such cases. The answer to question number 2 from Gail, who talks about the fact that she's young and new and having to interact with more senior executives, I think shows a nice understanding of the business. It may make us also wonder whether or not she thinks of herself as an analyst, because she talks about that where she knows her data and she knows the work that she's done. And so she feels comfortable in her analytical capabilities, but you see her get a little bit hesitant about convincing people to change. And so once again, this issue of, is she somebody who's going to be able to grow in our job and really have those kinds of client interactions and get energy out of those client interactions, or instead maybe be a little bit fearful of those. And then finally, the answer number 3 from Jen, where she talks about credibility. I thought it was a good answer. There was nothing wrong with it. And clearly she understands our business. She's giving a straight down the middle description of one of the concerns that happens about all management consultants, which is our clients know more than we do about their own business. But we haven't learned much about Jen from this answer. And so we probably want to push a little bit more on that because we don't know what she's actually concerned about. But once again, 3 great answers will be very helpful to further interviewers and how we might think about a closing process.